we have the knowledge already. Either we have to remember or we need to learn what we've already been given. There's nothing that new to be found. It's about remembering who we are. There's so much potency and power and mana that flows through the ocean, and it's humbling, but it makes you loyal.
Welcome to the Ocean State of Mind. I'm your host, Damian Evans. I'm an educator and an ocean lover, investigating novel ways we can learn from and help sustain the health of our oceans by bringing awareness to our relationship with them. The Ocean State of Mind is a proud project of the Ocean Foundation. On today's episode, we have Luke Hosty, a veteran of the elite British commando unit, the Royal Marines, and co-founder of the ocean-focused impact agency Protect Blue. He shares how curiosity led him to war and how freeing his mind through breathwork and the art of freediving helped bring him home. If you've ever been interested in learning more about intentional breathwork, freediving, and living a life with intention and purpose, listen up. Luke and I met last fall in New York City when he and his business partner and my friend Lindsay Hawken were in New York City for the United Nations Climate Summit. I was meeting Lindsay to catch up and record her story for the podcast, which you'll have to listen to as well. We all shared a bottle of wine and delicious pizza, and after Lindsay and I talked, I said, who should I have on the podcast next? She immediately turned with a smile and said, Damian, you should ask Luke about his relationship with the ocean. So here it is. Enjoy. So Luke, it's great to see you again. Why don't we start by just rewinding the tape from our conversation in New York, and if you would, share a bit about your relationship with the ocean and freediving, and then we can get into how that shaped your return from war as a soldier in the British Royal Marines. Sound good?
Yeah, sure. I'll kind of do a bit of a step back from there. I think it will help realize why I was able to step so deeply or so quickly into my connection with the ocean when I was in the Royal Marines. I grew up in Southern Africa and spent a lot of time in the bush. So we had a lot of coastal relationships up in Transkei and Eastern Cape and Mozambique. But the connection with, I'd say, fresh water also comes down to rivers, the Zambezi, the Nile, and large lakes and so on. But even with the ocean, the connection has always been a Toyota Hilux, rugby shorts, flip-flops or trainers and a spear gun and fins. But it's always been about jumping in rougher seas. And so fast forward all that time, I've always played competitive water polo and swimming. So I've always been very comfortable in the water and always spent the majority of my life in water and in the ocean, but not in the traditional surfing sense. Because of that upbringing, that's what took me to the Royal Marines. And I just wanted to continue that way of life and push myself in my 20s just to see what I was capable of. And
Luke, can you describe the Royal Marines for those that may not be aware?
Yeah, the Royal Marines is the phrase most used with the Royal Marines is it's a state of mind. And I remember sitting in a cinema and seeing an advert come on TV, and at the end of it, it was short, dark, and vicious and very specific. And at the end, it just said 99.9% need not apply. And I think that's just kind of that caught my that caught my attention, and I think that's really, it does a nice job on paving the most important thing about the Royal Marines, which is the state of mind and the mindset of the volunteers that go towards that kind of training. And for a lot of us, if not all of us, the rest of the armed services isn't an option, and it's not really a choice. We are an offensive, ground-taking commandos, and we are raiders by tradition. And we actually traditionally belong to the Navy. And, if you reel back to D-Day and those kind of raiding missions, we were the first on the beach. But since the wars of our time in the last 2 decades have been very much infantry led. So we lent ourselves to the infantry war. And I never, although we do the training for raiding, we really were mostly trained and practiced in infantry war, which led us into Iraq and Afghan. So although it's not our traditional role as raiders, that's where we've been operating for the last couple of decades.
Thank you. And a lot of our conversation was about your coming home, and I wonder if you can talk through what that journey's been like.
Yeah, I come from an unconditional loving family. I'm well educated. Joining the Marines was a luxury for me. A lot of the guys who are there, they don't have that security, if that's at home or kind of through job. So I think that kind of dedication and being shaped by the Royal Marines, I've always had a belonging outside of it, and I've always been shaped by my family and my cultures and my traditions. So when I went to the Marines, I always needed the balance between not having that completely take over my mind. And I was fair game to my whole family for a 4-week period. I couldn't be defensive, but I would need to answer why I made that choice. And if they knew that I could talk through and they could see that I was making that choice for the right reasons, they were really concerned of my soul. And they really understood at the end of it that I wasn't just jumping into it. I'm not a gun-ho person, but my curiosity led me to war, and not understanding the world we live in and understanding what's the difference between good or bad. And I really didn't want to get to the end of my life and realize just on my dying bed on what kind of life I should have lived. So I really believed in putting myself through the gauntlet at an early stage, but I also believed that I could survive it from a spiritual perspective, and so did my family. And that meant that I needed a very strong tool in order to lean on during that time, because it's a very intense environment, and it's a very intense process to shape yourself into a Royal Marine Commando. And it's like that for a reason. But I think as you said, the homecoming can be the contrast can be quite something, and quite a shock to the system. And in some cases, with some guys, a car crash experience of leaving one world and entering the other. So I was very specific about using my brakes in the Royal Marines. Like, I was single, and if I wasn't totally within the commando world, I was freediving. And I built myself up over about 5 years before going on operational tour, where a lot of the guys kind of take their money and either go to Thailand or do whatever's kind of that life. I was pretty dedicated over that time to training myself up in the art of freediving. And I took the mindset that the Royal Marines gave me and dedicated to kind of two paths running parallel to each other. And when I was actually in Afghan, I didn't have access to the ocean, and especially for pre-deployment training beforehand, for about 1.5 years. But the 5 years leading up to there, I built myself up going through level 1, level 2, level 3, and then became an instructor in freediving, and then did my level 1. And then I had my level 2 course, which I had booked in 8 weeks after coming back from operational tour. And I'd kind of done that as my own failsafe, to know that I was going to be held by something else on the other end that I had been dedicated to over that 5-year period. So when I wasn't on the ground in Afghan, I would spend time in the compounds that we would take over, kind of as our checkpoints and our forward operating bases. And I would do apnea training. And that dry apnea training is still to kind of feed into the mammalian dive reflex and also the mental visualization process that would enable me to plug back into my free diving and back into the ocean when I got home, which is incredibly powerful. I think a lot of people don't realize that although you are away from the ocean gave me those skills, and that kept me very centered while being away. And I only got that from the ocean. So while being away from the ocean for that long, it gave me the tools, the necessary tools in order to keep my sanity. I went back to a place that I used to return to over the 5 years, which was Dahab in the Red Sea in South Sinai in Egypt. And there's a place called, Dahab's got the Blue Hole, the Great Blue Hole, and you got Dean's Blue Hole in Long Island, Bahamas. You got the Great Blue Hole of Belize, but the Hub Blue Hole was my sanctuary and my energy point that I would return to. And instead of going off to Thailand or continuing or kind of start drinking, so I didn't drink for almost like a year while I was on operational service, I continued not to drink and stay in that state for another 2.5 months. And I went straight back into freediving. And I pretty much purged myself in the blue hole, because the one thing about freediving is if you don't clear your mind, you're not going to hit your depths. And the thing with freediving is it takes up to 40 to 50% of the oxygen in your body just to power your mind. So it doesn't really matter if your thoughts are positive or negative, you still need that same amount of energy or that same amount of fuel in order to actively problem solve and to use your brain. So
yeah. Let me ask you a question. So I know the level 1, 2, and 3 training, it's training that allows you to hit different depths. Can you talk about what those are and maybe just a little bit around what the types of training look like?
Yeah, with freediving, it's line training. So you've got a buoyancy platform at the top of the water, and then you've got a weighted line that drops down to varied depths depending on either the level that you're at or your capability. So level 1, you're going to be playing and aiming for depths around 12 to 15 meters. And then level 2, you're going to start pushing through to the 20-meter mark. And then level 3 and level 4, you would, depending on your capability and depending on your comfort, not everyone hits those depths, but it's to make you more effective at that kind of level of freediving. But you're definitely going to start pushing towards that kind of 30-meter, 40-meter mark. So you're almost looking at it as like 10-meter increments every time you're kind of moving up the depths. And then generally, this isn't a rule of thumb that there's a lot of different perspectives in freediving, but a lot of the kind of beliefs is, you need to be comfortable at the 60, 70-meter mark as an instructor in order to safely look after others who are kind of doing any others, or either helping other professional freedivers and being their safety for the depths that they're hitting. So I was slowly moving myself through the marks of getting comfortable around the 60 and 70-meter mark, which in today's world of the freedivers, that isn't much. But for me at the time, especially because I held a lot of muscle mass, I wasn't built as a freediver, I was built as a soldier. And so, that gave me my own challenges. So my mental state was more important than ever because I had my own physical restrictions. So coming home from tour, it all seems to be that 10 months of a very kinetic tour. I was from 4-2 Commando, and our unit, we suffered 7 casualties in our tour. It was a very kinetic tour, and there was a lot to process, not only for me, but as our team on a whole. But by the time I got into the water, I realized that time in the blue hole and that time spent in freediving, that I was going to end up reliving my tour in order to hit the depths. And that every dive, I was just hitting these blocks, and I just wasn't able to penetrate or even even navigate my own way around my mind. And I lent on a coach who was living in Dahab at the time, who I'm still very close to today, called Sarah Campbell. And she runs a program called Discover Your Depths. And she worked very hard with me to help me unlock my mental tools in order to, and give me the breathing practices and tools in order to discover my depths and find ways around my own barricade. So I had my breakdowns right there in Dahab, like mental, physical, breathing, total, like almost, just total 100% breakdowns while reliving my tour. But by the time I got through that period in Dahab, which was just 7 weeks of just freediving, there were no blind spots left. I got to the end of that process, and I don't, like, from today or any day past that period, there's nothing I don't understand of what happened to me, of the decisions that I made. And I know there aren't any fractures in my foundation that may catch up to me one day and that I don't recognize and may hit me through a blind spot. And I'm very grateful for that. And it's something that I'm very clear on. And it gave me my peace. And it was in Dahab when I remember phoning my mom and coming to this revelation of realizing that also, number one, I was ready to walk a peaceful path. I believed that throwing myself, I used the word earlier, kind of a gauntlet. I believed I could take it, but I really, until that point, was quite happy to throw myself into very dangerous situations or challenging situations that I believe I could survive spiritually, but in order for me to learn life's greatest lessons. And once I'd got to the other side of doing my level 2 instructor's course, it wasn't really about the skills, and I also wasn't doing it actually to open up a freediving school. I was doing it to learn as in depth the art and about myself, and I was very limited unless I learned what the instructors were learning themselves. So yeah, that really, it allowed me to not only kind of come out of that, I went straight back to the Marines, but I then very quickly turned to becoming a trauma and risk manager to help other Royal Marines go through and realize what's perhaps kind of the barriers that they were coming up against. And the first question I would always ask them is, can you make sense of what has happened? If you can come back and go, a lot of bad shit happened, but I know I made the best decision I could out of 2 bad decisions.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for that. That's amazing. Luke, thank you so much for sharing that story. There's a lot of questions I have, but the veterans work is so interesting, and maybe we could talk a little bit more.
Yeah, I got injured after our tour. We then went to Norway to go do our Arctic warfare and survival training. And I was out there for 6 months, and I kind of sustained an injury that ended up me having to have an operation on both my ankles because I had essentially broken both of them. So that, I believe, ended up being an intervention in my path. I was steamrolling I went through commando training. I got sick in commando training. I got forced out of the military, and then I fought a medical battle to get back in. I redid commando training. I was lucky enough to get the King's Badge, which allowed me to choose my path straight out of training. I went straight into a sniper's course, then deployed in that role, and then came out of there, went straight into Norway training, then became a commander. And so I was in one mindset, which was just to kind of climb and just keep on perfecting and sharpening my tools. So getting the injury that I sustained in Norway, I was very happy to have the Arctic experience that I did, but it kind of halted me I was in a high gear, going flat out in a very focused kind of career. And it halted me and allowed me to step back, and it pushed me straight into rehabilitation after I'd broken my ankles, and put me amongst a lot of struggling soldiers and a lot of the guys who were actually from my time on operations, who were either dealing with thoracic injuries from gunshot wounds or mental injuries or back injuries, a whole array of stuff. And because of my skills by that point as a freediver, I started to work with the physios and the rehabilitation instructors, where they allowed me to run a breathing class for all new soldiers coming into rehabilitation. And that helped them in their role because I would teach diaphragmatic breathing, which would allow guys to recenter. So it's using diaphragmatic breathing instead of thoracic, and teaching them the cycles of breathing 1 to 2, which is breathing out twice as long as you breathe in. Then that means you're dropping your heart rate with every breath, which means essentially you're teaching yourself how to heal with every breath. And then once you've got that cycle right of diaphragmatic breathing, any training that they put into, you can almost say that they, like a rifle, they've been zeroed. And then any program you put them into is actually accurate data, because they don't have irregular breathing where their BPM is up and down. They've actually now centered, they have their baseline, and then the data or their input is going to be accurate on a continuous basis. And then they allowed me to do 2 water sessions a week with the guys. And that's when I was able to start to move forward with actually dealing with the guys, where I would actually I would teach the breathing, I would teach basic freediving, and I'd do dynamic, which means you're just doing lengths of a pool. You're actually not dealing with the extra dimension of depth, but you're dealing with the mental clarity and getting guys to kind of deal with being used to being in a non-supportive life form underwater and being comfortable. So the guys would come up and you're like, why did you come up? And the guys go, I don't know. And getting guys to listen to their bodies, listen to the signs and symptoms, and being able to clear their minds and to ignore their natural instincts, which is like, I'll make it to the end, or I can't make it to the end. You started to see this evolution and development of beautiful freediving in patterns of these soldiers. But for me, freediving was a spiritual challenge. But for these guys, all I was doing was framing it in a physical challenge. I was going, listen, like, you're never going to be able to make it 3 or 4 or 5 lengths because your mind's in the way. You're eating all your fuel is going to your brain because you're not shutting off your brain. Shut off your brain and you'll actually see what your body's capable of. And just by framing a physical challenge to these guys, they would have to go on that personal journey anyway, which is just to still your mind. Like, just take the rest, take the healing time, and then allow new thoughts to come in. And that would really affect the kind of, and intervene in the rut that a lot of the guys were in.
Yeah, it's amazing. When we were talking about this before, I think I was in the middle of teacher training to become a mindfulness teacher. And you'd said it was basically, this is another door to get there that might be a bit more accessible to a soldier who's looking for, might need the competitive thought of, I'm trying to go 2 laps or I'm trying to go 3 laps. One question I have for you, when you're diving, whether you're just in the pool doing dynamic free diving or, just doing laps, or if you're out in the ocean, what does it feel like for you and your body when you dip under the water?
Before I get into the water, I think it becomes I become a lot switched off, where my social skills take a dive about like half an hour before I'm kind of going into the water. Within my job as a profession, the majority of my work is as a filmmaker and photographer in the water. And that means I can actually take that time to prep my housing and to just dive into my gear. And that becomes my mental build up into the water. So my visualization of what I'm getting in to do and to just watch the ocean is really important a part of the process. When I get into the water and before I put my head under, I equalize my ears, which is kind of step one. It's such a small thing, but like, if it's, the biggest pressure change that you will feel is at the surface. So my mental respect for at the surface is much higher than when I start diving down. So the intensity of making sure that my respect for the ocean, that I'm okay, that I'm in the right mindset, and I'm physically kind of set myself up, is as I drop my head down. And I'm really paying attention to all those things. And the final thing is to make sure that if I do the first step right at the surface, and the last thing, which is to equalize correctly, I'm going to open the gateway for me to dive wherever I need to go. I get that wrong at the surface, and I'm going to have issues all the way down, and I'm going to always have to return. But if I get this first step right, then like dominoes, the rest of it will fall. And then as I do my duck dive, I'm still stuck with saying the same thing to me, which is just let go.
What is your typical last minute before you're about to do, say, a longer dive look like? Like what are you doing with your breathing specifically?
I'm putting my head under the water because we have the mammalian dive reflexes. The sensors just below our eyes are kind of set. They are essential kind of, they are kind of sensors that allows us to know whether we're underwater or on water. So, for example, if a freediver or anyone blacks out underwater, the first things we do is take off their mask and blow hard across the face, because the face knows that like 90% of the time the person's going to come around just through that process. That's like the trigger switch to the body to say you're back at the surface. But if you don't remove that from the face and you don't blow across the face, those are the first switches that will come off, and the body will go, oh, it's actually okay to come out of this state because I'm no longer underwater. And 90% of the time, the person comes around and won't need CPR. So in reverse, getting ready to dive is that even if you're at home and you put on your heart rate monitor, go run some cold water from the tap, put it in a bucket and put your head in, and take your breathe up and just put your head underwater. From someone who doesn't free dive, you'll watch your heart rate drop by at least 20 BPM. So we kind of make tapping into all the natural gifts that we've been given, which is our mammalian dive reflex. And, our body is equipped to be able to survive for longer periods in the water. And also another part is kind of diuresis, is that when you start to dive, all the blood rushes from you get peripheral vasoconstriction. So from your peripheries, all your blood goes to your core and looks after your vital organs. So your heart doesn't have to work as hard. And that's why you kind of pee underwater, because your body actually thinks that you've got a lot more liquid in your body than you would normally do. And that's the signs and the triggers that your mammalian dive reflex is actually working. Is that when you start peeing, you're like, cool, my body's actually pushing myself into survival mode in order to make sure that I can dive. So I'm using my snorkel and I'm doing my breathe ups with my head in the water, because that's the most adaptive way that I'm going to dive. But I'm also, just by putting my head underwater and looking at what's going on and starting to navigate the bottom of the ocean, all of those things is where I prefer to be than just having my head above the surface popping around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing what's baked in, into our bodies from a long time ago.
Yeah, I think it's, we've been saying this recently of just talking about people's connection to the ocean. And I think, number one, we talk about talking about things positively, but also that we have the knowledge already. Either we have to remember or we need to learn what we've already been given. There's nothing that new to be found. It's about remembering who we are, or having the modesty to learn what our capabilities are, and being able to listen. Like for our bodies is to be able to listen to your signs and symptoms, but the education to understand what is capable is that all our gifts have already been given to us. It's whether we can tap into them or not. And the modesty comes in taking the time to go learn more about ourselves, not find yourself, but remember who you are.
Yeah. You mentioned, and I know that much of your work now is in photography and video, which is a form, I suppose, of capturing a memory. And I wonder, is your interest in photography connected to this remembering?
I think, listen, I've always done fine art. I then studied fine art. I then studied art direction and design, and what kept me sane, other than my freediving tools, is that in the back of my Bergen, as Marines, we man carry everything, which means we've got everything we need on our back. We don't really need food. We're not vehicle born soldiers. So we've got 3 metal struts that are in the back of our Bergen, and I pulled out mine, and I used to keep an A3 drawing pad with me wherever I went. And then I'd also just, as soon as we got into our sentry positions and we would put down our harbors in training and on operations, I would volunteer myself to go to the OPs and I would do all the drawings for our OP positions, which means I would scan the landscape and restructure and redraw everything around our position or from our operational viewpoints, because that was just my kind of key. And so our studio is just covered from all my drawings from all the years, most of it as a soldier. And photography for me was just another way of capturing or being able to translate a human story, not necessarily just a beautiful landscape, but being able to capture an emotion. So I'm not much of a studio photographer, as in like light and perfect scene. I like to capture life as it is. So I've always been addicted to telling a story as raw and as honest as it is. And that's what I'm addicted to. But that came through my love of art and then a photo. And then I couldn't ever choose one photo. It would be a collection of photos as almost like a storyboard, which just projected me into film. So I went to London Film School and did documentary directing and production straight after the Marines, just to project myself forward into my storytelling capability that would allow me to move through my art and through my photography and into real-time documentary storytelling.
That's so interesting. And now you're, co-founder of the creative agency Protect Blue. Maybe talk a little bit about what the stories you are telling with your clients.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I was kind of with the work before. I had kind of 2 years before I met Lindsay, and Lindsay approached me a couple of years back to help do a visual art piece that would be underwater ocean made out of ocean plastics. That would be an experience for people that were going to the plastic free community, which she was one of the co-founders of, where they were getting their certificate from Surfers Against Sewage. So that ended up with Lindsay and I being caught in a barn for 2 weeks, threading together nearly 5,500 plastic bottles. And so we're sitting in this ocean of plastic bottles, and we just had all the time in the world to talk. And we realized really soon that our pathways were very aligned in what we were wanting to achieve. But ever since I've had my son Kai, I've been very focused on, let me rewind. My parents are teachers, and all the different places I've lived in Southern Africa have been on schools. My parents kind of started orphanages and built schools and would hand them over to communities, and we'd move through that passage. So I've always been brought up in the heart of education, and also believing that at the heart of every community is education and is our children. And it does take a community to raise children. So I kind of always felt like, well, I went down through the art route and then through the kind of expedition soldiering route. And in my family, I would feel like an imposter by saying that I belonged in education, because compared to the rest of my family, I was the one that didn't take that path. But I believed so much in the capacity for true education and storytelling and awareness. And that I thought by the end of my career, maybe in 15 years' time, I would be able to move towards, or have the right to, or figured out how to move into education. in my work and use my storytelling capability to educate others and start to work with the youth and do it within the environmental space. And I didn't know how to. And Lindsay rocked up and said, and to just like totally just kind of like come in with, I'm like, oh, I've just been working on this and this and this, and I do this with sub kids, and it was all just education. And she'd just written the most beautiful curriculum called Ambassadors for the Planet, and it just blew my mind. Like, listen, it was all kind of like, in Dropbox and spreadsheets and stuff, which was like got me so excited because I was just, and I again felt like a imposter, and all I wanted to do was turn around and go like, can I do it? I'm like in. And even though we didn't say that, within like 2 weeks, we had restructured everything, dropped all the other work that we were doing, and kind of created Protect Blue. And everything has just been like totally 50-50, because in order to bring this stuff to life, it was a beautiful thing to know that we couldn't do it without each other. And 50-50 was what she did with her education and her strategy, which is just another side. And I was just all about how things look and the beauty of storytelling and the visualization. And we threw these two things together, and shit just exploded. Like, it just like the work, and we just agreed, and we know how we wanted to look. We both dedicated to the brutal truth, no matter what someone believes that it should look like, and real impact. And I was finding myself working in purpose-driven work in education, and I swear to God, I was like, in 15 years' time, if I get this right, I will have the privilege for my end of my career to kind of look like this. And I was just all of a sudden just gifted this opportunity to permanently live in this space that I wouldn't have to feel like I was guessing it, but I was working with someone that gave me the confidence and the guidance to get educated and realize what real impact looked like. Our job is to be the guardians of the truth and help people find their path or find their perfect footing within their lane. So there's just not one day that we second guess our work. So our work is just totally this perfect mix match of, we're both facilitators, and we both have this kind of mindset where we know how to work and we love working with people. And it allows us to work with this diversity of clients that, like, for example, like we're now doing this continued work with the Pitcairn Islanders in the middle of the South Pacific. Like, these guys are from the HMS Bounty. They're pretty much pirates. I work with my former veterans, John Slayer, who's my dive partner, and I can just be thrown straight into those expeditions. It's just seamen, it's knowledgeable, we're still telling stories, but like, it's just about getting shit right. And, and so we can go from hardcore expeditions and working with like basic pirates who live out in the South Pacific to really having, all the way down to working with primary school children. And we've got this beautiful diversity in our work and purpose-driven brands, but we work in a very specific lane, but the diversity within that lane makes it feel sometimes that we just do 100 million different things, but we're actually very dedicated to the tools and the craft that we do and the services that we offer people, but the diversity of clients that are now working and we're able to help in the purpose driven lane is quite something.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, you've clearly found your purpose, and you talk about how the work helps others find their path. And when I think of a couple of things you've said just in this conversation, even at the beginning, where you saw an advertisement for the Royal Marines and it said 99.9% need not apply, and your hand went up. So presumably part of the answer of how people find their path is a ton of commitment, but I wonder what else is needed.
Curiosity. Like,
you said curiosity led you to war, which was an amazing statement.
Yeah. But listen, like curiosity, like when you starting to get confused of I'm sure I'm not the only one on this point. When people are just, you watch the news, you see these different perspectives, you see this onslaught on social media, and you've got, these 1,000,000,000 different views on what is right and what's wrong, and what people think, what life you should be living, and what you should be buying, and what's important, and how you become an influencer. It's confusing. Like, I was confused years ago, right? If I had being exposed to what's now, like, I don't know, I think it would kind of blow my mind. You shouldn't have to question what you think is real, right? So I came back from war, and what I understand from war is that I don't understand it, and that's okay. It's so fucked up that, and it's not strictly just a religious war, and it's not a war versus good and evil. It's power, and it's money, and it's all those things, and it's so many things met into it that there actually wasn't a lesson to take away from it, other than be okay that you don't need to understand it. And I kind of came back from war, and I kind of allowed myself to not go, I need to know the answer, but actually just step away from it and just go, this shit is so sideways and so 360, and there's so many elements in this. You're not meant to know what it is. Just crack on with what you're doing. And life just became simpler. I'm like, right, okay, I'm responsible for myself, and the rest of what I know is real, and where I get my connection is nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll throw one more thing on there. It's just, the only thing that is real is your breath, and the one thing I can control is my breath. Like, everything else is a perception, and I understand that is my perception as well. Like, I had a certain day today, so my mind is already warped into a certain mindset, and then I'm going to walk into a situation and I'm going to see it a certain way. It doesn't mean that's right or wrong. It doesn't mean someone else is right or wrong. And if I keep on chasing to figure out whether I'm right or wrong, that anxiety and that stress of going, is that person right? Am I right? Am I fooling myself? And just to be able to step back and go, listen, either it hasn't happened yet, or it's happened. And if it's happened, there's a million perspectives that are right, and mine can't even be the right one. What is real? My breath. What can I control? My breathing cycle. And I just step straight back into this back pedal of a healing process, and just take a moment out, and I trust in that. And those are my tools.
So let me ask you this. I saw, I don't remember where, that you recently wrote about diving on the coral cathedrals of Henderson. And you shared that, and I'm going to read what you wrote. Spiritually, you haven't been absorbed by a force of living energy as much as you were diving through the seascapes off the island. And I wonder, what did it feel like to be absorbed by a force of living energy like that?
Like being thrown in a cauldron of, that throws me back to that statement of not meant to understand what this all is. And there's so much potency and power and mana that flows through the ocean, and these points where this tapu comes through. And Henderson, luckily, we're looking at visibility of over 70 meters visibility, right? So what we're looking at is these coral on the eastern side of Henderson Island. The CFAS guys were with us, and they were dropping, Simeon was dropping his cameras down past 120 meters, and this coral structure was still 100% coral cover down to those depths. So the surge of coral was coming up, and you can see in some of the photos, and like, some people go, wow, those photos are amazing. And I'm just gutted the whole time. I'm like, I can't, if I could pour the energy that was in this place, and you can see how the coral grows, and then they all these different shapes and molds, and just they all spiral together, and you can see the energy forms coming from below and the sides of the islands, and they all just formed into this cathedral that was like a 3-story building. Like, it's just absolutely like formidable. And it was almost the opposite of why I, over the years, have been addicted to blue holes. And I recently just went to Belize Blue Hole and why I'd go to Dahab and why I'd go to Long Island, to Dean's Blue Hole, is like you've got this surge of energy that is so concentrated in this area, you can feel it pulling you down. And in the case of Henderson, it was coming up through. Like the blue holes is like, it feels like it's a magnet that pulling you into the energy that's going into the center of the earth and wants to spit you out somewhere else on the other side. And for Henderson, it felt like all the energy force had been pulled through from these other centric points around the globe and was actually coming out at Henderson and was pouring through the crustal layers and through the mantle and through this coral formations, and we could just feel it in the water. And it's humbling, but it makes you loyal. Like, that's a weird thing to say, but like the loyalty of like I hate the word bow down, like it's bullshit, right? But loyal to serve. And that's what it kind of like, this is why we're here. And you almost start following, like we're diving or scuba diving, you start to follow the almost like the pattern of what the fish are doing, right? You almost like keep your distance and you start to almost move around it. It's very kind of like a hypnotic motion that you end up falling into, that it pulls you into. It's not something you even have to think of. And it just goes, this is what we're a part of and this is what we serve. Yeah. And then you run out of air.
I love it. I love it. Well, I feel like I've been absorbed by a force of living energy in the last hour. Thank you so much, Luke, for sharing your story and just giving time to this. It's an incredible life you've lived already, and I can't wait to continue to observe and watch. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Damien, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. Have a good rest of your day.
Cool. Speak soon.
Cheers. Wow. Thank you, Luke, for sharing that inspirational story and your strategies for living your best life. And thanks for tuning in to another episode of Ocean State of Mind. Next up is Bonnie Tsui. Bonnie is the author of the new book, Why We Swim. She is a lifelong swimmer, a surfer, mother, and frequent contributor to the New York Times. Her book and our conversation look at the science and magic of water and our relationship with it. See you there.